I'm here in the backyard of our little home on a half-acre land on a busy road. After a nice rain, it's been about a half-inch of rain today after a little dry spell. And I thought it'd be nice to take a meandering wander through the complexity of our backyard garden. It's probably about 1/10 of an acre, a little larger. I don't have a particular strong game plan or topic that I want to cover, but more just kind of a meandering wander and sharing with folks what's going on as we move towards the far end of summer and start thinking about how we're moving towards the fall. So stick with us. I'll plan to do an in-depth update on our attached greenhouse soon enough, but you can see our lovely friend Stan in there enjoying and looking out. You can see the west side over here has just finished up being in cucumbers. We took those out yesterday and Sasha's making pickles. And the tomatoes are still going strong. So we're making some plans to move that space and get it organized so that come winter we've got hopefully greens all throughout. I think there'll be a pattern you'll see in this landscape this time of year, that cucurbits, the wild squash that come along in the compost. We have a hard time pulling healthy squash seedlings as they grow. And you can see I've used the push mower in this little section of lawn to mow a meandering path around all the random wild squash. When the first frost comes, they'll get zeroed out pretty quickly. We'll compost them and set them aside, but there's something beautiful at the end of the summer. They're not really getting in the way. We can always trim them if they do pop up into beds where we need the space. We've got a wild ornamental gourd that's creeping and crawling like crazy up this kitchen space, and we just ask it not to completely cover the seedling apricot box, but other than that it's free to roam and explore. But there's still some good production, some more deliberate things happening. This bed just to the south of all this craziness, we've got a couple zucchinis in there, and then where we had some gaps after harvesting some cabbages, Sasha went ahead and put in some sweet potatoes that had sprouted, and they're sprawling. They're going to be a nice fill. She cooks with those greens quite a bit. And in the space between them, I've seeded out some red Russian kale, little patches of seedlings. So the first frost, a lot of this will disappear, and hopefully the kale will be able to fill out a little bit. You can see the same patterns happening over here. The wild amaranth is growing. That kind of came in on the compost. And in another month or two after our first frost, the kale will probably be the only character that's in this particular spot. I got myself stuck talking for quite a while in just one little area. I have a feeling that'll be what happens with this video. Maybe we'll wander towards the main garden. This is the path we take many times a day coming out from our garage under this massive, beautiful wild apple. It's a crab apple. All summer, this apple provides some really amazing protection in the form of shade and shelter from heavy winds, so Sasha's beautiful houseplants get to enjoy a mimic of a tropical jungle understory. It adds so much color as we walk out here. It's going to be nice to bring them inside, and I'll also miss seeing all this color outside here too. And what we normally do is walk through towards the main garden. I'll come back around here and look at a little bit some of these broccoli, some nursery work, some medicinal herbs in the form of lemon balm, using some lamb's ear as a pathway edge, just working really nicely. We'll come back over here in a little while. We're also transitioning this high tunnel space and getting it ready for fall treatments. It looks a little dry and a little beat up on the south side. We just cleared out a lot of what was going on in there. That'll be for another video too. But you can see our Miyoga ginger, which overwinters outside just fine, is really growing beautifully indoors. And Sasha's already made a few rounds of jam with these husk cherries that have been growing like mad on the north side. It's a fun space. Even after this rain, it really looks droughty in there. It's a reminder to not have too many covered spaces, since we have to hand water everything with collected rainwater. This rain really pushed down some herbs. We've got curly mint here growing just outside the garden. We've been waiting, kind of keep forgetting to harvest it. We want to cut it flush to the ground and let it rebound. We'll dry that for herbs for the winter. So this path is a little throttled, but we can sneak through. And coming into the main garden, the reality is we'd like to be more organized, more on top of things than we are, but it is what it is, and it feels worth just showing things as they happen to be. The birds really love this chaos and wildness. We found some rabbits that have snuck through a little bit here or there, but there's enough diversity and enough density happening that for the most part, most days of the week we can come out and harvest some things and make meals from what's growing in here, and at the same time have nursery stock for sale through the website, and at the same time have it be wild enough that the feral wild beings can come through and enjoy eating some seedless grapes and some elderberry fruit and the like. So it works well enough for us. Let's look at how we manage some beds that have gotten away from us completely. This bed here you can see is an ornamental mini garlic growing. There's some lupins, there's some kale, there's some beans, there's some shiso, there's some flowers, but this whole bed overall is this crazy circuitous back and forth serpentine shape that we've playfully laid out. And this section in here, it had nigella, it had some other balloon flowers and some beautiful things happening, but we really lost them to the weeds, so to speak. And so rather than hand pulling every single plant that was in there, we're going a bit more in the Ruth Stout direction of laying into the mulch as a solution to weeds and garden prep. So we're not going to try to plant this out this fall. What I simply did is stepped over every single plant that was in here. Weeds that we pulled from other garden beds we dumped on top, and then laid a thick layer of hay. You can see some squirting out of the side there where some plants weren't fully pinned over. Now we're putting some compost on top. Those cucumbers I just took out of the greenhouse attached to the house, they came and were laid onto here. That will get hay on top, that will get compost on top. And maybe we'll seed this out to a quick radish in a week or two, or some kale or some lettuce seed if we've got that laying around. But it's a way to reclaim garden space after a little bit of a loss as far as management is concerned in the summer, but without being aggressive to the soil. It's not a guaranteed functional way to go, but it certainly builds the soil overall. And building up is a lot nicer in some ways than building down or digging down, but we do that too. Just a few feet to the west of it is this smaller teardrop-shaped bed that has been fully dug out, and the reason for that is this bed was a nursery bed. I had a whole bunch of elderberry, some Japanese negi onions, there were some cranberries, there's some sweet cicely, but it was getting overrun with various weeds, and hand weeding it was getting tiresome. So in this case I dug out all of the nursery stock, soaked them in water and potted them up so they'll be ready for fall shipping. And now in this case we smoothed it out. We're letting the weeds germinate once more. There's a fair bit of calendula and the like popping up. And now that we've gotten this nice rain, we can go through, smooth this out, add a little compost, and transplant in some nice fall appropriate seedlings into here and see if we can't reclaim this space for the fall. So it's two different ways that we go about managing beds that have gotten away from us, just depending on the situation. Let's look at some other spots. We'll move through towards the west side and look a little bit at some of the nursery beds that we've got going on. So here's one where we've got a lupin and a honey locust on the east corner, an anise hyssop which was a volunteer, but since we like that plant and we'd love to be able to offer it eventually through the nursery, we certainly are happy to have it here. And all of these little shoots are ranch elderberry. We're learning that if we put in root fragments, they can sprout from root fragments as well. So a lot of nursery stock happening in this bed. Cuttings from seaberry that were softwood cuttings taken last summer that overwintered were transplanted in on the edge. So it's another nitrogen fixing element that also happens to be nursery stock. Those are growing beautifully here. And then we just got from our friend JP over at Mandala Farm down in Staten Island some really beautiful iris versicolor. So we put those in on the edge. So predominantly a nursery bed, a little bit of wild stock in there as well. And that bed seems to be doing really nicely for itself. On this end of the garden, which trends towards being just incredibly overly wet, we've laid out the beds actually to run north-south, which is anti-contour, so they go up and down slope, with the idea that when we get incredibly heavy rains, there is a channel for the water to run. You'll say, what about slow it, spread it, sink it? Yes, almost always. In very, very wet sites, sometimes you need to vent some of that excess water, and so that's what we're doing here. We have silt catches downstream of this. But let's look at this first bed. This is where it starts getting really complex, as though the other stuff wasn't. We were able to get these kaleidoscope kales. They're looking a little haggard at the end of the season here. Maybe they will be perennial here. They're known to be perennial in zone 6. We're going to leave some in the garden. We'll put some in pots in our basement. We'll put some in our greenhouse. But it's going to be exciting to see if we can get a perennial kale in our area. We've got some calendulas and anise hyssops. Again, these are volunteers, but very happy to have them. In the middle of this bed, they're dwarfed a little, but they're growing, are some suckers of serviceberry, Amelanchier, and so we're promoting them in the middle. We'll keep throwing some soil around them. And this gives you an idea of just how wet our site is. One of the weeds, so to speak, is, let me just step over here, celeriac, which, just like celery, loves really wet context. We had celeriac growing here last year. It dropped some seed, and now celeriac is this really dominant plant in here. A little red clover for nitrogen, some celeriac, some parsleys are growing well. You can see a poplar tree popped up. So we get horsetail, poplars, creeping jenny, different nut sedges, all wetland indicators in this part of the garden. So it's challenging, but as long as we keep taking those indicators and move in the direction of saying, okay, if it's wet, what can we grow that likes wet, then we should be okay. So we've got some other diversity in here that's all holding on just fine. Some green shiso. And then we say, let's go with the wet lovers. So at the far end of this bed is a number of varieties of cultivar willows. Each year we're trying to get 5 to 10 new varieties to manage. And so this season we put cuttings in, and they adore how wet it is. A lot of these cuttings are taller than me, and this is their first year here. So as they sprouted and grew, I would come in and throw some soil around them. Somehow some persimmon seedlings showed up, so we are mulching around those as well. And in the fall, we'll be able to dig up a whole bunch of willow plants from here and move them to other wet areas of the property and maybe sell them through the website. As it gets even wetter further west here, we've committed one of these last beds in the space to willows. They will not be dug up and moved. These are beds where there are 2 or 3 of each of the types of willows, and we'll collect cuttings from them. So some over here, they've got aluminum tags on locust staves, a little block of senna in the middle to provide some nitrogen. We may dig that up for the nursery. And it just continues on with all wet-loving willows down this whole line. Because just on the other side of them, between me and them, is a trench here that has a whole bunch of watercress and sedges growing. Very, very wet, accumulating space. Even cattails growing. Now this is a high point in the garden, and yet we can dig down and get a pond. So I just renovated this pond recently. It had filled in with silt and was completely filled. It was just a wet muck silt hole with cattails growing out of it. The reason for that is because the original trench that allowed water into it came right down and right in. So every time there was a heavy rain and water was running, it brought silt directly into this pond until it filled up. It took about 4 years to do so. But by digging down, I took all of the silt up and out, threw it onto the fence line over here, threw it all along this area around these young sea berries, around these currants, seeded it out to a mix of carrots and lettuce and radishes and the like. It's a little wild on this side, but it works. And dug this pond back out to about 4 feet deep, so it's a nice deep pond as far as hand dug is concerned. And now the water is set that there's a berm here, so the water can't hit this and go directly in, but rather ride through this walkway, dropping silt as it goes, and then once it gets to this area, it can make a 90-degree turn, bleed over, go through some creeping jenny, and go into the pond. And the hope is that we can harvest the silt out of these walkways and onto the garden beds. So we'll fill these out with more willows and seaberry once this little friend moves. You'll move by the fall, I bet. We'll transplant a seaberry next to where you are. So we'll fill this out with shrubs that like all that wetness and be able to manage this space with all the silt that comes in without having it fill the pond. But you can see I'm not kidding when I say we've got a really wet spot. We knew that currants were very tolerant of wet conditions. On the outside of the fence we've got some black currants. In here we've got pink currants. It's been such a delight to see that seaberry not only can handle wet conditions but seems to absolutely adore wet context. So we've got, and hazelnut too, that was a nice surprise. We've got a male seaberry, a few little pops of male seaberry here, there, and then cultivar female seaberries right down this whole fence line. So in the winter, when water is running through this walkway, they're basically on the berm next to that waterway. When they're not in the way, the amaranth and the wild squash are happily invited to continue to grow, so we'll collect whatever seed and fruit we can get from them. More seaberry, more pink currants in this case. These have been in the ground. This is their second year here, and most of them are taller than me. So once a plant gets taller than me, it's quite exciting. They're generally good to go. And here's that Miyoga ginger, which has proven to be -13 Fahrenheit hardy with no protection. We're psyched to be able to offer this through the website next fall. We're going to keep building up stock. We're going to test it again this winter, but we'll put it in some other more harsh conditions and see how it fares. But we may have a perennial ginger available. Of course, with all this wetness, rice makes a lot of sense. So here we're growing Dvorskin rice, which is an upland rice that in a nursery bed here is growing beautifully. We also were trialing just dropping the seeds into the waterway, and in some spots it washed away after heavy rain, and in others it seemed to stick. But they seem to enjoy getting a little bit of coddling and TLC at the outset. That's enough for 3 or 4 good bites of rice. We've got some scaling up to do. This video's run for quite a bit, so I'm not going to take too much more of your time, but I thought I would look at the east side of the garden, which is another wet spot. The center of the garden is not too bad as far as overall moisture, but the edges are way wetter. As you can see, the elderberry, as on the low part of a real wet area, absolutely adores it. So it's kind of fun. We come back to more nursery places in here. Very high density and diversity again. If there is a theme with all the work, it's definitely that. A given bed might have a minimum of 5 to 6 species, so that if 3 of them fail for some reason or get browsed, we still have something. We generally get all of them. So here's a bed with beautyberry. A friend of mine let me take some softwood cuttings last year. We rooted them in bubbling water, so we'll get to taste the fruit. I haven't gotten amazing reviews on them, but they grow well, and so that's kind of fun. A couple more beautyberry. We've got tarragon mixed throughout. Tarragon and seaberry, very similar looking beings. It's kind of fun there. This bed with the profusion soil running through the middle has just next to it, which is very compatible to have allium as a line of a given crop next to other plants. It's so thin, you can really pack them in there. In this case, these are perennial leeks that are running down a line right here, doing really well for themselves, certainly growing bigger the more sun they get. So I'm learning from this line that the ones deeper in the shade, back in there, much slower growing than the ones up here. I pulled some weeds that were on the edge of this bed, and we happened to have a black Spanish round radish that had gone to seed, so we seeded that out, and so we'll get some radishes from the side of this bed as well. So predominantly it's perennial nursery stock to be lifted and shipped and sold, but why not throw some annuals in there And in the center of this bed, we've got a more permanent element in the form of 2 honeyberries that are both named cultivar Japanese types, and those are being stooled in the center of the bed. So we've got herbaceous, perennial nursery plants that are also food for us to harvest. We've got annuals filling out whatever gaps and edges there are. In fact, I just added some compost around these honeyberry yesterday, so we'll most likely seed out this compost to a 40-day or 50-day crop, so maybe arugula or lettuces, to use that soil instead of leaving it bare. And then some permanent elements that can be propagated from. So one bed's got a whole lot of different functionality mixed together, very close together, and they seem quite happy about it. The northeast corner of this garden's got some really beautiful things happening, a lot of which we didn't really intend or plant. In fact, every sunflower you see in front of you has been planted in little clusters by chipmunks who stole, so to speak, the seed from our chicken yard and planted them out all around the garden in clusters, and we were happy to just leave them. They seem compatible enough. And this really long vine is another wild squash seedling that was in the way of the path. This was the path earlier in the summer, and it just kind of crept right along the path, so I sent it back along. I was going to pull it early on, but then I realized, well, this part of this garden bed was pretty overrun with weeds, so we just had the path for the season come up into the garden bed, and we've been putting weeds and hay and mulch over here. We're walking on that, and then we can put some compost there and reclaim that next spring and not have a squash right here. But in the meantime, for having just walked 1 foot around it, we're going to get what looks like the biggest butternut I've ever seen. It's upside down, so we'll see if it ripens. But that's a meal for a few people in exchange for walking 1 foot off to the side. Kind of nice to give some time for plants to reveal who they are and see if you can adjust rather than having to adjust them. Awfully weedy, kind of wacky in here, but overall fine enough. There's some delicata squash growing along there. You can see our comfrey rhizome barrier on the outside of the fence doing some lovely work. We're looking forward to harvesting some of those greens soon to send to our chickens. And another hand-dug pond on this side. At some point probably will need to be dredged out, but there's still enough water holding capacity in between all of these cattails that we'll leave that for a while. We'll let that swell up and see what it can do. And we're learning some of the plants that really adore being next to these ponds. Like I mentioned, the seaberry. Here we've got skirret. It's laying down right now after the heavy rain, but that's a perennial carrot family member that we can dig up in the early spring, and it loves the wetness. So we'll keep promoting skirret and calamus and seaberry and all sorts of interesting perennial food and medicine bearing plants next to our little ponds. Here we've got some cabbages running on one side with persimmons through the middle with grafted apples, and then so this is a 4 foot wide bed. Cabbages, persimmons, grafted apples, and then perennial leeks. These have been here a little longer, so you can see they're pom-poms of seed. Perennial leeks snuck right in there, and then the edge of the bed are pawpaws. So sauerkraut making on one side, and then nursery stock all through the middle. In a 4 foot bed, we've got 5 different rows of crops, and they're all growing just fine. I guess there is a theme to this video, and most of them is around the idea of really mimicking that pattern that nature provides all the time of packing folks in, plant folks in, super close to one another, keeping it feral and diverse and tight, and letting it figure itself out as it goes. A lot of this garden is a wild mess. It's run away from us a bit this season, but overall it's a place that feels pretty enjoyable to be in, and certainly works quite well as far as generating food and medicine and nursery stock that we need in order to keep ourselves moving forward. It's just a long video, but it still somehow is only a snapshot. Thanks for watching.